The Wonderful Weaver in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18 from Old Greek Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wonderful Weaver by James Baldwin. 1. The Warp. There was a young girl in Greece whose name was Arachne. Her face was pale but fair, and her eyes were big and blue, and her hair was long and like gold. All that she cared to do from morn to noon was to sit in the sun and spin, and all that she cared to do from noon to night was to sit in the shade and weave. And oh, how fine and fair were the things which she wove in her loom! Flax, wool, silk, she worked with them all, and when they came from her hands, the cloth which she had made of them was so thin and soft and bright that men came from all parts of the world to see it. And they said that cloth so rare could not be made of flax or wool or silk, but that the warp was of rays of sunlight and the woof was of threads of gold. Then as, day by day, the girl sat in the sun and span, or sat in the shade and wove, she said, "In all the world there is no yarn so fine as mine, and in all the world there is no cloth so soft and smooth, nor silk so bright and rare." "Who taught you to spin and weave so well?" someone asked. "No one taught me," she said. "I learnt how to do it as I sat in the sun and the shade, but no one showed me." "But it may be that Athena, the queen of the air, taught you, and you didn't know it." "Athena, the queen of the air? Bah!" said Arachne. "How could she teach me? Can she spin such skeins of yarn as these? Can she weave goods like mine? I should like to see her try. I can teach her a thing or two." She looked up and saw in the doorway a tall woman wrapped in a long cloak. Her face was fair to see, but stern, oh so stern, and her grey eyes were so sharp and bright that Arachne could not meet her gaze. "Arachne," said the woman, "I am Athena, the queen of the air, and I have heard you boast. Do you still mean to say that I have not taught you how to spin and weave?" "No one has taught me," said Arachne, "and I thank no one for what I know." And she stood up, straight and proud, by the side of her loom. "And do you still think that you can spin and weave as well as I?" said Athena. Arachne's cheeks grew pale, but she said, "Yes, I can weave as well as you." "Then let me tell you what we will do," said Athena. 3 days from now we will both weave, you on your loom and I on mine. We will ask all the world to come and see us, and great Jupiter, who sits in the clouds, shall be the judge. And if your work is the best, then I will weave no more so long as the world shall last. But if my work is best, then you shall never use loom or spindle or distaff again. Do you agree to this?" "I agree," said Arachne. "It is well," said Athena, and she was gone. 2. The Wolf. When the time came for the contest in weaving, all the world was there to see it, and great Jupiter sat among the clouds and looked on. Arachne had set up her loom in the shade of a mulberry tree, where butterflies were flitting and grasshoppers chirping all through the livelong day. But Athena had set up her loom in the sky, where the breezes were blowing and the summer sun was shining, for she was the queen of the air. Then Arachne took her skeins of finest silk and began to weave, and she wove a web of marvellous beauty, so thin and light that it would float in the air, and yet so strong that it could hold a lion in its meshes, and the threads of warp and woof were of many colours, so beautifully arranged and mingled one with another that all who saw were filled with delight. "No wonder that the maiden boasted of her skill," said the people, and Jupiter himself nodded. Then Athena began to weave, and she took of the sunbeams that gilded the mountain top, and of the snowy fleece of the summer clouds, and of the blue ether of the summer sky, and of the bright green of the summer fields, and of the royal purple of the autumn woods. And what do you suppose she wove? The web which he wove in the sky was full of enchanting pictures of flowers and gardens, and of castles and towers, and of mountain heights, and of men and beasts, and of giants and dwarfs, and of the mighty beings who dwell in the clouds with Jupiter. And those who looked upon it were so filled with wonder and delight that they forgot all about the beautiful web which Arachne had woven. And Arachne herself was ashamed and afraid when she saw it, and she hid her face in her hands and wept. "Oh, how can I live," she cried, "now that I must never again use loom or spindle or distaff?" And she kept on weeping and weeping and weeping and saying, "How can I live?" Then, when Athena saw the poor maiden would never have any joy unless she were allowed to spin and weave, she took pity on her and said, "I would free you from your bargain if I could, but that is a thing which no one can do. You must hold to your agreement never to touch loom or spindle again. And yet, since you will never be happy unless you can spin and weave, I will give you a new form so that you can carry on your work with neither spindle nor loom." Then she touched Arachne with the tip of the spear which she sometimes carried, and the maiden was changed at once into a nimble spider, which ran into a shady place in the grass and began merrily to spin and weave a beautiful web. I've heard it said that all the spiders which have been in the world since then are the children of Arachne, but I doubt whether this be true. Yet, for aught I know, Arachne still lives and spins and weaves, and the very next spider that you see may be she herself. End of The Wonderful Weaver in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. Read by Victoria Sandals, Stockholm, February 15th, 2023.
Story of the Brahmin's Wife and the Mongoose in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from Tales of the Sun, or Folklore of Southern India. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chinmay. The Story of the Mongoose and the Brahmin's Wife, collected by Mrs. Howard Kingscote and Pandit Natesa Satri. On the banks of the Ganges, which also flows by the most holy city of Benares, there is a town named Mithila, where dwelt a very poor Brahmin named Vidyadhara. He had no children, and to compensate for this want, he and his wife tenderly nourished in their house a mongoose, a species of weasel. It was their all in all, their younger son, their elder daughter, their younger son, their younger daughter. So fondly did they regard that little creature. The god Viveshvara and his spouse Visalakshi observed this, and had pity for the unhappy pair. So, by their divine power, they blessed them with a son. This most welcome addition to their family did not alienate the affections of the Brahmin and his wife from the mongoose. On the contrary, their attachment increased, for they believed that it was because of their having adopted the pet that a son had been born to them. So, the child and the mongoose were brought up together as twin brothers in the same cradle. It happened one day that when the Brahmin had gone out to beg alms of the pious and charitable, that his wife went into the garden to cull some pot herbs, leaving the child asleep in his cradle, and by his side the mongoose kept guard. An old serpent, which was living in the well in the garden, crept into the house and under the cradle, and was beginning to climb into it to bite the child, when the mongoose fiercely attacked it and tore it into several pieces, thus saving the life of the Brahmin's little son, and the venomous snake that came to slay itself lay dead beneath the cradle. Pleased at having performed such an exploit, the mongoose ran into the garden, to show the Brahmin's wife its blood-smeared mouth, but she rashly mistook the deliverer of her child for his destroyer, and with one stroke of the knife in her hand, with which she was cutting herbs, she killed the faithful creature, and then hastened into the house to see her dead son. But there she found the child in his cradle, alive and well, only crying at the absence of his little companion, the mongoose, and under the cradle lay the great serpent cut to pieces. The real state of affairs was now evident, and the Brahmin, presently returning home, his wife told him of her rash act, and then put an end to her life. The Brahmin, in his turn, disconsolate at the death of the mongoose and his wife, first slew his child, and then killed himself. End of the story of the mongoose and the Brahmin's wife in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
The Story of Cupid and Psyche in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. From the Junior Classics, Volume 2, Folk Tales and Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mariah Kerr. The Story of Cupid and Psyche by Thomas Bulfinch. A certain king and queen had 3 daughters. The charms of the 2 elder were more than common, but the beauty of the youngest was so wonderful that the poverty of language is unable to express its due praise. The fame of her beauty was so great that strangers from neighboring countries came in crowds to enjoy the sight, and looked on her with amazement, paying her that homage which is due only to Venus herself. In fact, Venus found her altars deserted, while men turned their devotion to this young virgin. As she passed along, the people sang her praises and strewed her way with chaplets and flowers. This gave great offense to the real Venus. Shaking her locks with indignation, she exclaimed, "Am I, then, to be eclipsed in my honors by a mortal girl? She shall not so quietly usurp my honors. I will give her cause to repent of so unlawful a beauty." Thereupon, she calls her winged son, Cupid, mischievous enough in his own nature, and rouses and provokes him yet more by her complaints. She points out Psyche and says to him, "My dear son, punish that obstinate beauty. Give thy mother a revenge as sweet as her injustices are great. Infuse into the bosom of that haughty girl a passion for some low, mean, unworthy being, so that she may reap a mortification as great as her present exaltation and triumph." Cupid prepared to obey the commands of his mother. There are 2 fountains in Venus's garden, one of sweet waters, the other bitter. Cupid filled 2 amber vases, one from each fountain, and, suspending them from the top of his quiver, hastened to the chamber of Psyche, whom he found asleep. He shed a few drops from the bitter fountain over her lips, though the sight of her almost moved him to pity, then touched her side with the point of his arrow. At the touch she awoke and opened her eyes upon Cupid, himself invisible, which so startled him that in his confusion he wounded himself with his own arrow. Heedless of his wound, his whole thought now was to repair the mischief he had done, and he poured the balmy drops of joy over all her silken ringlets. Psyche, henceforth frowned upon by Venus, derived no benefit from all her charms. True, all eyes were cast eagerly upon her, and every mouth spoke her praises, but neither king, royal youth, nor plebeian presented himself to demand her in marriage. Her 2 elder sisters, of moderate charms, had now long been married to 2 royal princes. But Psyche, in her lonely apartment, deplored her solitude, sick of that beauty which, while it procured abundance of flattery, had failed to awaken love. Her parents, afraid they had incurred the anger of the gods, consulted the oracle of Apollo and received this answer: "The virgin is destined for the bride of no mortal lover. Her future husband awaits her on the top of the mountain. He is a monster whom neither gods nor men can resist." This dreadful decree of the oracle filled all the people with dismay, and her parents abandoned themselves to grief. But Psyche said, "Why, my dear parents, do you now lament me? You should rather have grieved when the people showered upon me undeserved honors, and with one voice called me a Venus. I now perceive that I am a victim to that name. I submit. Lead me to that rock to which my unhappy fate has destined me." Accordingly, all things being prepared, the royal maid took her place in the procession, which more resembled a funeral than a nuptial pomp, and with her parents, amid the lamentations of the people, ascended the mountain, on the summit of which they left her alone, and with sorrowful hearts returned home. While Psyche stood on the ridge of the mountain, panting with fear and eyes full of tears, the gentle Zephyr raised her from the earth and bore her with an easy motion into a flowery dale. By degrees her mind became composed, and she laid herself down on the grassy bank to sleep. When she awoke refreshed with sleep, she looked round and beheld nearby a pleasant grove of tall and stately trees. She entered it, and in the midst discovered a fountain, sending forth clear and crystal waters, and fast by a magnificent palace, whose august front impressed the spectator that it was not the work of mortal hands, but the happy retreat of some god. Drawn by admiration and wonder, she approached the building and ventured to enter. Every object she met filled her with pleasure and amazement. Golden pillars supported the vaulted roof, and the walls were enriched with carvings and paintings representing beasts of the chase and rural scenes. Proceeding onward, she perceived that besides the apartments of state, there were others filled with all manner of treasures, and beautiful and precious productions of nature and art. While her eyes were thus occupied, a voice addressed her, though she saw no one, uttering these words: "Sovereign lady, all that you see is yours. We, whose voices you hear, are your servants, and shall obey all your commands with our utmost care and diligence. Retire, therefore, to your chamber, and repose on your bed of down, and when you see fit, repair to the bath. Supper awaits you in the adjoining alcove when it pleases you to take your seat there." Psyche gave ear to the admonitions of her vocal attendants, and, after repose and the refreshment of the bath, seated herself in the alcove, where a table immediately presented itself, without any visible aid from waiters or servants, and covered them with the greatest delicacies of food. Her ears, too, were feasted with music from invisible performers, of whom one sang, another played on the lute, and all closed in the wonderful harmony of a full chorus. She had not yet seen her destined husband. He came only in the hours of darkness, and fled before the dawn of morning. But his accents were full of love, and inspired a like passion in her. She often begged him to stay and let her behold him, but he would not consent. On the contrary, he charged her to make no attempt to see him, for it was his pleasure, for the best of reasons, to keep concealed. "Why should you wish to behold me?" he said. "Have you any doubt of my love? Have you any wish ungratified? If you saw me, perhaps you would fear me, perhaps adore me, but all I ask of you is to love me. I would rather you would love me as an equal than adore me as a god." This reasoning somewhat quieted Psyche for a time, and while the novelty lasted, she felt quite happy. But At length the thought of her parents, left in ignorance of her fate, and of her sisters, preyed on her mind and made her begin to feel her palace as but a splendid prison. When her husband came one night, she told him her distress, and at last drew from him an unwilling consent that her sister should be brought to see her. So, calling Zephyr, she acquainted him with her husband's commands, and he, promptly obedient, soon brought them across the mountain down to their sister's valley. They embraced, and she returned their caresses. "Come," said Psyche, "enter with me my house, and refresh yourselves with whatever your sister has to offer." Then, taking their hands, she led them into her golden palace, and committed them to the care of her numerous train of attendant voices, to refresh them in her baths and at her table, and to show them all her treasures. The view of these celestial delights caused envy in their bosoms, at seeing their younger sister possessed of such state and splendor, so much exceeding their own. They asked her numberless questions. Among others, what sort of person her husband was. Psyche replied that he was a beautiful youth who generally spent the daytime in hunting upon the mountains. The sisters, not satisfied with this reply, soon made her confess that she had never seen him. Then they proceeded to fill her mind with dark suspicions. "Call to mind," they said, "the Pythian oracle that declared you destined to marry a direful and tremendous monster. The inhabitants of this valley say that your husband is a terrible and monstrous serpent, who nourishes you for a while with dainties that he may by and by devour you. Take our advice. Provide yourself with a lamp and a sharp knife. Put them in concealment that your husband may not discover them, and when he is sound asleep, slip out of bed, bring forth your lamp, and see for yourself whether what they say is true or not. If it is, hesitate not to cut off the monster's head, and thereby recover your liberty." Psyche resisted these persuasions as well as she could, but they did not fail to have their effect on her mind, and when her sisters were gone, their words and her own curiosity were too strong for her to resist. So she prepared her lamp and a sharp knife, and hid them out of sight of her husband. When he had fallen asleep, she silently rose and, uncovering her lamp, beheld not a hideous monster, but the most beautiful and charming of the gods. With golden ringlets wandering over his snowy neck and crimson cheek, with 2 wings on his shoulders, whiter than snow, and with shining feathers like tender blossoms of spring. As she leaned over to have a nearer view of his face, a drop of burning oil fell on the shoulder of the god, startled with which he opened his eyes and fixed them full upon her. Then, without saying one word, he spread his white wings and flew out of the window. Psyche, in vain endeavoring to follow him, fell from the window to the ground. Cupid, beholding her as she lay in the dust, stopped his flight for an instant and said, "Oh, foolish Psyche, is it thus you repay my love? After having disobeyed my mother's commands and made you my wife, will you think me a monster and cut off my head? But go, return to your sisters, whose advice you seem to think preferable to mine. I inflict no other punishment on you than to leave you forever. Love cannot dwell with suspicion." So saying, he fled away, leaving poor Psyche prostrate on the ground, filling the place with mournful lamentations. When she had recovered some degree of composure, she looked around her, but the palace and gardens had vanished, and she found herself in the open field not far from the city where her sisters dwelt. She repaired thither and told them the story of her misfortunes, at which
pretending to grieve, those spiteful creatures inwardly rejoiced. "For now," said they, "he will perhaps choose one of us." With this idea, without saying a word of her intentions, each of them rose early the next morning and ascended the mountain, and having reached the top, called upon Zephyr to receive her and bear her to his lord. Then, leaping up, and not being sustained by Zephyr, fell down the precipice and was dashed to pieces. Psyche, meanwhile, wandered day and night, without food or repose, in search of her husband. Casting her eyes on a lofty mountain, having on its brow a magnificent temple, she sighed to herself and said, "Perhaps my lord inhabits there," and directed her steps thither. She had no sooner entered when she saw heaps of corn, some in loose ears and some in sheaves, with mingled ears of barley. Scattered about lay sickles and rakes, and all the instruments of harvest, without order, as if thrown carelessly out by the weary reaper's hands in the sultry hours of the day. This unseemly confusion Psyche put an end to, by separating and sorting everything to its proper place and kind, believing that she ought neglect none of the gods, but endeavor by her piety to engage them all in her behalf. The holy Ceres, whose temple it was, finding her so religiously employed, thus spoke to her. "Oh, Psyche, truly worthy of our pity. Though I cannot shield you from the frowns of Venus, yet I can teach you how best to allay her displeasure. Go then, and voluntarily surrender yourself to your lady and sovereign, and try by modesty and submission to win her forgiveness, and perhaps her favor will restore you the husband you have lost." Psyche obeyed the commands of Ceres and took her way to the temple of Venus, endeavoring to fortify her mind and ruminating on what she should say and how best to propitiate the angry goddess, feeling that the issue was doubtful and perhaps fatal. Venus received her with angry countenance. "Most undutiful and faithless of servants," said she, "do you at last remember that you really have a mistress? Or have you rather come to see your sick husband, yet laid up with the wound given him by his loving wife? You are so ill-favored and disagreeable that the only way you can merit your lover must be by the dint of industry and diligence. I will make trial of your housewifery." Then she ordered Psyche to be led to the storehouse of her temple, where was laid up a great quantity of wheat, barley, millet, vetches, beans, and lentils, prepared for food for her pigeons, and said, "Take and separate all these grains, putting all of the same kind in a parcel by themselves, and see that you get it done before evening." Then Venus departed and left her to her task. But Psyche, in perfect consternation at the enormous work, sat stupid and silent, without moving a finger to the inextricable heap. While she sat despairing, Cupid stirred up the little ant, a native of the fields, to take compassion on her. The leader of the ant-hill, followed by a whole host of his six-legged subjects, approached the heap, and with utmost diligence, taking grain by grain, they separated the pile, sorting each kind to its parcel, and when it was all done, they vanished out of sight in a moment. Venus, at the approach of twilight, returned from the banquet of the gods, breathing odors and crowned with roses. Seeing the task done, she exclaimed, "This is no work of yours, wicked one, but his, whom to your own and his misfortune you have enticed." So saying, she threw her a piece of black bread for supper and went away. Next morning, Venus ordered Psyche to be called and said to her, "Behold, yonder grove which stretches along the margin of the water. There you will find sheep feeding without a shepherd, with golden fleeces on their backs. Go fetch me a sample of that precious wool, gathered from every one of their fleeces." Psyche obediently went to the riverside, prepared to do her best to execute the command. But the river god inspired the reeds with harmonious murmurs, which seemed to say,
"O maiden, severely tried, tempt not the dangerous flood, nor venture among the formidable rams on the other side, for as long as they are under the influence of the rising sun, they burn with a cruel rage to destroy mortals with their sharp horns or rude teeth. But when the noontide sun has driven the cattle to the shade, and the serene spirit of the flood has lulled them to rest, you may then cross in safety, and you will find the woolly gold sticking to the bushes at the trunks of the trees."
Thus the compassionate river god gave Psyche instructions how to accomplish her task, and by observing his directions, she soon returned to Venus with her arms full of golden fleece. But she received not the approbation of her implacable mistress, who said, "I know very well that it is by none of your own doings that you have succeeded in this task, and I am not satisfied yet that you have any capacity to make yourself useful. But I have another task for you. Here, take this box and go your way to the infernal shades, and give this box to Proserpine, and say, 'My mistress Venus desires you to send her a little of your beauty. For tending her sick son, she has lost some of her own. Be not too long on your errand, for I must paint myself with it to appear at the circle of the gods and goddesses this evening.'" Psyche was now satisfied that her destruction was at hand, being obliged to go with her own feet directly down to Erebus. Wherefore, to make no delay of what was not to be avoided, she goes to the top of a high tower to precipitate herself headlong, thus to descend the shortest way to the shades below. But a voice from the tower said to her,
"Why, poor unlucky girl, dost thou design to put an end to thy days in so dreadful a manner? And what cowardice makes thee sink under this last danger, who has been so miraculously supported in all thy former?"
Then the voice told her how by a certain cave she might reach the realms of Pluto, and how to avoid all the dangers of the road, to pass by Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and prevail on Charon, the ferryman, to take her across the Black River and bring her back again. But the voice added,
"When Proserpine has given you the box filled with her beauty, of all things this is chiefly to be observed by you, that you never once open or look into the box, nor allow your curiosity to pry into the treasure of the beauty of the goddess."
Psyche, encouraged by this advice, obeyed it in all things, and taking heed to her ways, traveled safely to the kingdom of Pluto. She was admitted to the palace of Proserpine, and, without accepting the seat or delicious banquet that was offered to her, but contented with coarse bread for her food, she delivered her message from Venus. Presently, the box was returned to her, shut and filled with the precious commodity. Then she returned the way she came, and glad was she to come out once more into the light of day. But, having got so far successfully through her dangerous task, a longing desire seized her to examine the contents of the box. "What?" said she. "Shall I, the carrier of this divine beauty, not take the least bit to put on my cheeks to appear to more advantage in the eyes of my beloved husband?" So she carefully opened the box, but found nothing there of any beauty at all, but an infernal and truly Stygian sleep, which, being thus set free from its prison, took possession of her, and she fell down in the midst of the road, without sense or motion. But Cupid, being now recovered from his wound, and not able longer to bear the absence of his beloved Psyche, slipping through the smallest crack of the window of his chamber, which happened to be left open, flew to the spot where Psyche lay, and gathering up the sleep from her body, closed it again in the box, and waked Psyche with a light touch of one of his arrows. "Again," said he, "hast thou almost perished by the same curiosity. But now perform exactly the task imposed on you by my mother, and I will take care of the rest." Then Cupid, as swift as lightning penetrating the heights of heaven, presented himself before Jupiter with his supplication. Jupiter lent a favoring ear, and pleaded the cause of the lovers so earnestly with Venus that he won her consent. On this, he sent Mercury to bring Psyche up to the heavenly assembly, and when she arrived, handing her a cup of ambrosia, he said, "Drink this, Psyche, and be immortal, nor shall Cupid ever break away from the knot in which he is tied, but these nuptials shall be perpetual."
End of the story of Cupid and Psyche in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
Cupid for the Beggar in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from Tales of the Sun, or Folklore of Southern India. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chinmay. Keep It for the Beggar by Lucas Cleave and Pandit Natesha Satsri. When anything sweet is prepared in the house on a particular night, and when the children, after feeding to their fill, say to the mother, "Amma, this pudding is sweet, keep it for the morning," the mother says at once, "Ask me to keep it for the beggar, and I shall do it." "Why should I not say, 'Keep it for the morning, Amma'?" ask the curious children, and the South Indian mother gives to her listening children the following story. In a certain village there lived an affectionate husband and wife. The husband would go to look after the fields and garden and return home with abundance of vegetables. The wife would cook and serve her lord to his fill. Before going out in the morning, the husband used to take whatever of last night's dishes were left cold to remain for his breakfast. The husband was a great eater of dal soup. Every night the wife used to prepare a large quantity of it, and leave a good portion of it to stand for the morning's breakfast of her lord. And he too, owing to his taste for the cold rice, used to warn his wife, though she was very careful, and say, "Keep some of this soup for the next morning." The wife used to say, "Yes, my dear husband, I shall do so." This went on for several years. Every day the dal soup was invariably prepared for the night meal, and a good portion of it was reserved for the cold rice. Every night the husband, without forgetting even for a single day, used to ask his wife to reserve a portion. Thus passed on several years, as we have already said. One night this husband had his supper. The wife had sat at her husband's leaf to take her supper after her lord had had his. At once a gurgling laughter was heard near the doorsill of their house. The pair were astonished, and searched their whole house. No one was discovered. Again the husband said, "Keep, my dear, some of this soup for the morning." Again the laughter was heard. Finding that the laughter immediately followed his order, The husband repeated it a third time. A third time also the laughter broke out. They were astonished. 3 times had laughter been heard in their house, and still they could see no one. Thinking that someone must have mocked him from the neighboring houses, he made careful inquiries and satisfied himself that none of his neighbors had mocked him. He was afraid at the laughter which thrice proceeded from a part of his house, as he had heard it distinctly. That very night our hero had a sudden and unforeseen calamity, and just as he was dragging the latch of his backyard door, a serpent stung him in the finger. Neighbors, hearing the venomous reptile in their next house, ran there with a stout cudgel. Already the master of the house, who was passionately fond of the dal soup, had swooned away. His wife was mourning by his side, saying, "My dear husband, how did you forget your soup so soon, and leave us all for the other world? Just now you gave me the order, and before tasting it even you have died." The neighbors began to search for the snake, but they did not succeed. And again a voice exclaimed from vacuum, "This husband's fate ended at the 12th Gatika of this night. Yama ordered me to go and fetch him to this world. I came down and reached this house at the 8th Gatika when the husband was giving the order to reserve for the morning meal his dear dal soup. I could not contain my laughter, and so broke out with a gurgling noise. As I am divine, no one could perceive me, and so none ever found me in this house after they heard the laughter. I then transformed myself into a serpent, and waited for the hour to do my death-dealing duty. The poor man is now no more. 4 Gatikas ago, he was of opinion that he would live and eat his cold rice tomorrow morning. How very sanguine people are in this world of uncertainty. The cause for my laughter was the husband's certainty when he issued that order to reserve the dal soup for the breakfast. Thus ended the messenger, and vanished of course to inform his master how he had executed his orders. And from that day, my children, it was fixed that our life in this world is always uncertain, and that one who lives at this moment cannot be sure of doing so at the next moment. While such is the case, how can you say, "Keep the pudding for tomorrow morning," since you saw in the story just related to you that we can never be certain of life? You must say instead of "for tomorrow morning," "for the beggar." If we keep it for the beggar, and if we fortunately live till tomorrow morning, we shall use a portion of it and give the remainder to the beggar. Hence you must always hereafter say, when any supper from overnight is to be left for the morning, "Keep it for the beggar, Amma." "Yes, mother, we shall do so hereafter," replied the children. In India, among Brahmins, the wife must never take her food before her lord, unless she is pregnant or sick. In these 2 cases, even on the days when it is possible to avoid the meal before her lord, the wife invariably does it. On other days, she cannot probably help it, when she is physically unable, and in taking the meal, the wife sits in front of the leaf dish, from which her husband has eaten. Most husbands generally leave their leaves clean, some out of pure affection to their wives and out of a good intention of not injuring the feelings of their wives. But there are also others who, as they are unclean in their habits, are also unclean in their eating. The appearance of their leaves after they have left off eating is like those thrown out in the streets and mutilated by crows and dogs. But their wives, cursing their lot to have married such husbands, must, as long as they are Orthodox, eat out of those leaves. End of Keep It for the Beggar in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
The Brahma Rakshas and the Hare. In Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. From Tales of the Sun or Folklore of Southern India. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sachi. The Brahma Rakshas and the Hare by Pandit Natesha Shastri. In a certain village, there lived a very rich landlord who owned several villages, but was such a great miser that no tenant would willingly cultivate his lands, and those he had gave him not a little trouble. He was indeed so vexed with them that he left all his lands untilled, and his tanks and irrigation channels dried up. All this, of course, made him poorer and poorer day by day. Nevertheless, he never liked the idea of freely opening his purse to his tenants and obtaining their goodwill. While he was in this frame of mind, a learned sannyasi paid him a visit, and on his representing his case to him, he said, "My dear son, I know an incantation, mantra, in which I can instruct you. If you repeat it for 3 months, day and night, a Brahma Rakshas will appear before you on the first day of the 4th month. Make him your servant, and then you can set at naught all your petty troubles with your tenants. The Brahma Rakshas will obey all your orders, and you will find him equal to 100 servants." Our hero fell at his feet and begged to be instructed at once. The sage then sat facing the east, and his disciple, the landlord, facing the west, and in this position formal instruction was given, after which the sannyasi went his way. The landlord, mightily pleased at what he had learned, went on practicing the incantation, till, on the first day of the 4th month, the great Brahma Rakshas stood before him. "What do you want, sir, from my hands?" said he. "What is the object of your having propitiated me for these 3 months?" The landlord was thunderstruck at the huge monster who now stood before him, and still more so at his terrible voice. But nevertheless he said, "I want you to become my servant and obey all my commands." "Agreed," answered the Brahma Rakshas in a very mild tone, for it was his duty to leave off his impertinent ways when any one who had performed the required penance wanted him to become his servant. "Agreed, but you must always give me work to do. When one job is finished, you must at once give me a second, and so on. If you fail, I shall kill you." The landlord, thinking that he would have work for several such Brahma Rakshasas, was pleased to see that his demoniacal servant was so eager to help him. He at once took him to a big tank which had been dried up for several years, and pointing it out, spoke as follows: "You see this big tank? You must make it as deep as the height of 2 palmyra trees, and repair the embankment wherever it is broken." "Yes, my master, your orders shall be obeyed," humbly replied the servant, and fell to work. The landlord, thinking that it would take several months, if not years, to do the work in the tank, for it was 2 kos long and 1 kos broad, returned delighted to his home, where his people were awaiting him with a sumptuous dinner. When enemies were approaching, the Brahma Rakshas came to inform his master that he had finished his work in the tank. He was indeed astonished and feared for his own life. "What? Finish the work in 1 day which I thought would occupy him for months and years? If he goes on at this rate, how shall I keep him employed? And when I cannot find it for him, he will kill me." Thus he thought, and began to weep. His wife wiped the tears that ran down his face and said, "My dearest husband, you must not lose courage. Get out of the Brahma Rakshas all the work you can, and then let me know. I'll give him something that'll keep him engaged for a very, very long time, and then he'll trouble us no more." But her husband only thought her words to be meaningless and followed the Brahma Rakshas to see what he had done. Sure enough, the thing was as complete as could be. So he asked him to plough all his lands, which extended over 20 villages. This was done in 2 ghatikas. He next made him dig and cultivate all his garden lands. This was done in the twinkling of an eye. The landlord now grew hopeless. "What more work have you for me?" roared the Brahmarakshas, as he found that his master had nothing for him to do, and that the time for his eating him up was approaching. "My dear friend," said he, "my wife says she has a little job to give you. Do it, please, now. I think that is the last thing I can give you to do, and after it, in obedience to the conditions under which you took service with me, I must become your prey." At this moment his wife came to them, holding in her left hand a long hair, which she had just pulled out from her head, and said, "Well, Brahmarakshas, I have only a very light job for you. Take this hair, and when you have made it straight, bring it back to me." The Brahmarakshas calmly took it, and sat in a peepal tree to make it straight. He rolled it several times on his thigh, and lifted it up to see if it became straight. But no, it would still bend. Just then it occurred to him that goldsmiths, when they want to make their metal wires straight, have them heated in fire. So he went to a fire and placed the hair over it, and of course it frizzled up with a nasty smell. He was horrified. "What will my master's wife say if I do not produce the hair she gave me?" So he became mightily afraid and ran away. The story is told to explain the modern custom of nailing a handful of hair to a tree in which devils are supposed to dwell, to drive them away. End of The Brahmarakshas and the Hare in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
The Northman Story of How All Things Began in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from the Junior Classics, Volume 2, Folktales and Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christina Norman. The Northman Story of How All Things Began by E. M. Wilmot Buxton. Once upon a time, before ever this world was made, there was neither earth nor sea, nor air nor light, but only a great yawning gulf full of twilight. To the north of this gulf lay the home of mist, a dark and dreary land, out of which flowed a river of water from a spring that never ran dry. As the water in its onward course met the bitter blasts of wind from the yawning gulf, it hardened into great blocks of ice, which rolled far down into the abyss with a thunderous roar, and piled themselves one onto another until they formed mountains of glistening ice. South of this gulf lay the home of Fire, a land of burning heat, guarded by a giant with a flaming sword, which, as he flashed it to and fro before the entrance, sent forth showers of sparks, and these sparks fell upon the ice blocks and partly melted them, so that they sent up clouds of steam, and these again were frozen into hoarfrost, which filled all the space that was left in the midst of the mountains of ice. Then one day, when the gulf was full to the very top, this great mass of frosty rime, warmed by the flames from the home of Fire and frozen by the cold airs from the home of Mist, came to life and became the giant Ymir, with a living, moving body and cruel heart of ice. Now there was as yet no tree, nor grass, nor anything that would serve for food in this gloomy abyss. But when the giant Ymir began to grope around for something to satisfy his hunger, he heard a sound as of some animal chewing the cud. And there, among the ice hills, he saw a gigantic cow, from whose udder flowed 4 great streams of milk, and with this his craving was easily stilled. But the cow was hungry also, and began to lick the salt off the blocks of ice by which she was surrounded. And presently, as she went on licking with her strong, rough tongue, a head of hair pushed itself through the melting ice. Still the cow went on licking, until she had at last melted all the icy covering, and there stood fully revealed the frame of a mighty man. Ymir looked with eyes of hatred at this being, born of snow and ice, for somehow he knew that his heart was warm and kind, and that he and his sons would always be the enemies of the evil race of frost giants. So indeed it came to pass, for from the sons of Ymir came a race of giants, whose pleasure was to work evil on the earth. And from the sons of the Iceman sprang the race of the gods, chief of whom was Odin, father of all things that ever were made. And Odin and his brothers began at once to war against the wicked frost giants, and most of all against cold-hearted Ymir. Now when, after a hard fight, the giant Ymir was slain, such a river of blood flowed forth from his wounds that it drowned all the rest of the frost giants, save one, who escaped in a boat with only his wife on board, and sailed away to the edge of the world. And from him sprang all the new race of frost giants, who at every opportunity issued from their land of twilight and desolation to harm the gods in their abode of bliss. When the giants had been thus driven out, All-Father Odin set to work with his brothers to make the earth, the sea, and the sky, and these they fashioned out of the great body of the giant Ymir. Out of his flesh they formed Midgard, the earth, which they lay in the center of the gulf, and all round it they planted his eyebrows, to make a high fence which should defend it from the race of giants. With his bones they made the lofty hills, with his teeth the cliffs, and his thick curly hair took root and became trees, bushes, and the green grass. With his blood they made the ocean, and his great skull, poised aloft, became the arching sky. Just below this they scattered his brains, and made of them the heavy gray clouds that lie between earth and heaven. The sky itself was held in place by 4 strong dwarfs, who support it on their broad shoulders as they stand east and west and south and north. The next thing was to give light to the new-made world. So the gods caught sparks from the home of fire, and set them in the sky for the stars. And they took the living flame, and made of it the sun and the moon, which they placed in chariots of gold, and harnessed to them beautiful horses, with flowing manes of gold and silver. Before the horses of the sun they placed a mighty shield to protect them from its hot rays. But the swift moon steeds needed no such protection from its gentle heat. And now all was ready, save that there was no one to drive the horses of the sun and the moon. This task was given to Mani and Sol, the beautiful son and daughter of a giant, and these fair charioteers drive their fleet steeds along the paths marked out by the gods, and not only give light to the earth, but mark out months and days for the sons of men. Then All-Father Odin called forth Night, the gloomy daughter of the cold-hearted giant folk, and set her to drive the dark chariot drawn by the black horse Frostymane, from whose long wavy hair the drops of dew and hoarfrost fall upon the earth below. After her drove her radiant son, Day, and his white steed Shining Mane, from whom the bright beams of daylight shine forth to gladden the hearts of men. But the wicked giants were very angry when they saw all these good things, and they set in the sky 2 hungry wolves, that the fierce gray creatures might forever pursue the sun and the moon, and devour them, and so bring all things to an end. Sometimes, indeed, or so say the men of the north, the grey wolves almost succeed in swallowing sun or moon, and then the earth children make such an uproar that the fierce beasts drop their prey in fear. and the sun and moon flee more rapidly than before, still pursued by the hungry monsters. One day, so runs the tale, as Mani, the man in the moon, was hastening on his horse, he gazed upon the earth and saw two beautiful little children, a boy and a girl, carrying between them a pail of water. They looked very tired and sleepy, and indeed they were, for a cruel giant made them fetch and carry water all night long, when they should have been in bed. So Mani put out a long, long arm, and snatched up the children, and set them in the moon, pail and all, and there you can see them on any moonlight night for yourself. But that happened a long time after the beginning of things, for as yet there was no man or woman or child upon the earth. And now that this pleasant Midgard was made, the gods determined to satisfy their desires for a home where they might rest and enjoy themselves in their hours of ease. They chose a suitable place far above the earth, on the other side of the great river which flowed from the home of mist, where the giants dwelt, and here they made for their abode Asgard, wherein they dwelt in peace and happiness, and from whence they could look down upon the sons of men. From Asgard to Midgard they built a beautiful bridge of many colors, to which men gave the name of Rainbow Bridge, and up and down which the gods could pass on their journeys to and from the earth. Here in Asgard stood the mighty forge where the gods fashioned their weapons wherewith they fought the giants, and the tools wherewith they built their palaces of gold and silver. Meantime no human creature lived upon the earth, and the giants dared not cross its borders for fear of the gods. But one of them, clad in eagle's plumes, always sat at the north side of Midgard, and whenever he raised his arms and let them fall again, an icy blast rushed forth from the mist home and nipped all the pleasant things of earth with its cruel breath. In due time the earth brought forth thousands of tiny creatures, which crawled about and showed signs of great intelligence. And when the gods examined these little people closely, they found that they were of two kinds. Some were ugly, misshapen, and cunning-faced, with great heads, small bodies, long arms, and feet. They were called trolls, or dwarfs, or gnomes, and sent them to live underground, threatening to turn them into stone should they appear in the daytime. And this is why the trolls spend all their time in the hidden parts of the world, digging for gold and silver and precious stones, and hiding their spoil away in secret holes and corners. Sometimes they blow their tiny fires and set to work to make all kinds of wonderful things from this buried treasure, and that is what they are doing when, if one listens very hard on the mountains and hills of the Northland, a sound of tap, tap, tapping is heard far underneath the ground. The other small earth creatures were very fair and light and slender, kindly of heart and full of goodwill. These the gods called fairies or elves, and gave to them a charming place called Elfland in which to dwell. Elfland lies between Asgard and Midgard, and since all fairies have wings, they can easily flit down to earth to play with the butterflies, teach the young birds to sing, water the flowers, or dance in the moonlight round a fairy ring. Last of all, the gods made a man and a woman to dwell in fair Midgard, and this is the manner of their creation. All-Father Odin was walking with his brothers in Midgard, where, by the seashore, they found growing two trees, an ash and an elm. Odin took these trees and breathed on them, whereupon a wonderful transformation took place. Where the trees had stood there were a living man and woman, but they were stupid, pale, and speechless until Hymir, the god of light, touched their foreheads and gave them sense and wisdom, and Loki, the fire god, smoothed their faces, giving them bright color and warm blood, and the power to speak and see and hear. It only remained that they should be named, and they were called Ask and Embla, the names of the trees from which they had been formed. From these two people sprang all the race of men which lives upon this earth. And now All-Father Odin completed his work by planting the Tree of Life. This immense tree had its roots in Asgard and Midgard and the Mistland, and it grew to such a marvelous height that the highest bough, the bough of peace, hung over the hall of Odin on the heights of Asgard, and the other branches overshadowed both Midgard and the Mistland. On the top of the peace bough was perched a mighty eagle, and ever a falcon sat between his eyes, and kept watch on all that happened in the world below, that he might tell Odin what he saw. Hadron, the goat of Odin, who supplied the heavenly mead, browsed on the leaves of this wonderful tree, and from them fed also the four mighty stags, from whose horns honey-dew dropped onto the earth beneath and supplied water for all the rivers of Midgard. The leaves of the tree of life were ever green and fair, despite the dragon which, aided by countless serpents, gnawed perpetually at its roots in order that they might kill the tree of life and thus bring about the destruction of the gods. Up and down the branches of the tree scampered the squirrel Ratatosk, a malicious little creature, whose one amusement it was to make mischief by repeating to the eagle the rude remarks of the dragon, and to the dragon those of the eagle, in the hope that one day he might see them in actual conflict. Near the roots of the tree of life is a sacred well of sweet water, from which the three weird sisters, who know all that shall come to pass, sprinkle the tree and keep it fresh and green. And the water, as it trickles down from the leaves, falls as drops of honey on the earth, and the bees take it for their food. Close to this sacred well is the council hall of the gods, to which every morning they rode over the rainbow bridge to hold converse together. And this is the end of the tale of how all things began. End of The Northman's Story of How All Things Began. In Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, read by Christina Norman.
How Thor Went to Jotunheim, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from the Heroes of Asgard, Tales from Scandinavian Mythology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How Thor Went to Jotunheim by A. and E. Kiri. From Asgard to Utgard. Once upon a time, Asa, Thor, and Loki set out on a journey from Asgard to Jotunheim. They traveled in Thor's chariot, drawn by 2 milk-white goats. It was a somewhat cumbrous iron chariot, and the wheels made a rumbling noise as it moved, which sometimes startled the ladies of Asgard and made them tremble. But Thor liked it, thought the noise sweeter than any music, and was never so happy as when he was journeying in it from one place to another. They traveled all day, and in the evening they came to a countryman's house. It was a poor, lonely place, but Thor descended from his chariot and determined to pass the night there. The countryman, however, had no food in his house to give these travelers, and Thor, who liked to feast himself and make everyone feast with him, was obliged to kill his own 2 goats and serve them up for supper. He invited the countryman and his wife and children to sup with him, but before they began to eat, he made one request of them. "Do not, on any account," he said, "break or throw away any of the bones of the goats you are going to eat for supper." "I wonder why," said the peasant's son Thialfi to his sister Roska. Roska could not think of any reason, and by the by, Thialfi happened to have a very nice little bone given him with some marrow in it. "Certainly there can be no harm in my breaking just this one," he said to himself. "It would be such a pity to lose the marrow." And as Asa Thor's head was turned the other way, he slyly broke the bone in 2, sucked the marrow, and then threw the pieces into the goats' skins, where Thor had desired that all the bones might be placed. I do not know whether Thialfi was uneasy during that night about what he had done, but in the morning he found out the reason of Asa Thor's command, and received a lesson on wandering why, which he never forgot all his life after. As soon as Asa Thor rose in the morning, he took his hammer, Mjolnir, in his hand, and held it over the goat skins as they lay on the floor, whispering runes the while. They were dead skins with dry bones on them when he began to speak. But as he said the last word, Thialfi, who was looking curiously on, saw 2 live goats spring up and walk towards the chariot, as fresh and as well as when they brought the chariot up to the door, Thialfi hoped. But no, one of the goats limped a little with its hind leg, and Asa Thor saw it. His brow grew dark as he looked, and for a minute Thialfi thought he would run far, far into the forest and never come back again. But one more look at Asa Thor's face, angry as it was, made him change his mind. He thought of a better thing to do than running away. He came forward, threw himself at the Asa's feet, and, confessing what he had done, begged pardon for his disobedience. Thor listened, and the displeased look passed away from his face. "You have done wrong, Thialfi," he said, raising him up. "But as you have confessed your fault so bravely, instead of punishing you, I will take you with me on my journey, and teach you myself the lesson of obedience to the Aesir, which is, I see, wanted." Raska chose to go with her brother, and from that day Thor had 2 faithful servants, who followed him wherever he went. The chariot and goats were now left behind, but, with Loki and his 2 new followers, Thor journeyed on to the end of Mannheim, over the sea, and then on in the strange, barren, misty land of Jotunheim. Sometimes they crossed great mountains. Sometimes they had to make their way among torn and ragged rocks, which often, through the mist, appeared to them to wear the forms of men, and once for a whole day they traversed a thick and tangled forest. In the evening of that day, being very much tired, they saw with pleasure that they had come upon a spacious hall, of which the door, as broad as the house itself, stood wide open. "Here we may very comfortably lodge for the night," said Thor, and they went in and looked about them. The house appeared to be perfectly empty. There was a wide hall, and 5 smaller rooms opening into it. They were, however, too tired to examine it carefully, and as no inhabitants made their appearance, they ate their supper in the hall and lay down to sleep. But they had not rested long before they were disturbed by strange noises, groanings, mutterings, and snortings, louder than any animal that they had ever seen in their lives could make. By and by the house began to shake from side to side, and it seemed as if the very earth trembled. Thor sprang up in haste and ran to the door. But though he looked earnestly into the starlit forest, there was no enemy to be seen anywhere. Loki and Thialfi, after groping about for some time, found a sheltered chamber to the right, where they thought they could finish their night's rest safely. But Thor, with Mjolnir in his hand, watched at the door of the house all night. As soon as the day dawned, he went out into the forest, and there, stretched on the ground close by the house, he saw a strange, uncouth, gigantic shape of a man, out of whose nostrils came a breath which swayed the trees to their very tops. There was no need to wonder any longer what the disturbing noises had been. Thor fearlessly walked up to this strange monster to have a better look at him. But at the sound of his footsteps, the giant shape rose slowly, stood up an immense height, and looked down upon Thor with 2 great misty eyes like blue mountain lakes. "Who are you?" said Thor, standing on tiptoe and stretching his neck to look up. "And why do you make such a noise as to prevent your neighbors from sleeping?" "My name is Skrymir," said the giant sternly. "I need not ask yours. You are the little Asa Thor of Asgard. But pray now, what have you done with my glove?" As he spoke, he stooped down and picked up the hall where Thor and his companions had passed the night, and which, in truth, was nothing more than his glove, the room where Loki and Thialfi had slept being the thumb. Thor rubbed his eyes, and felt as if he must be dreaming. Rousing himself, however, he raised Mjolnir in his hand, and trying to keep his eyes fixed on the giant's face, which seemed to be always changing, he said, "It is time that you should know, Skrymir, that I am come to Jotunheim to fight and conquer such evil giants as you are, and, little as you think me, I am ready to try my strength against yours." "Try it, then," said the giant, and Thor, without another word, threw Mjolnir at his head. Ah, said the giant, "did a leaf touch me?" Again Thor seized Mjolnir, which always returned to his hand, however far he cast it from him, and threw it with all his force. The giant put up his hand to his forehead. "I think," he said, "that an acorn must have fallen on my head." A third time Thor struck a blow, the heaviest that ever fell from the hand of an Asa, but this time the giant laughed out loud. "There is surely a bird on that tree," he said, "who has let a feather fall on my face." Then, without taking any further notice of Thor, he swung an immense wallet over his shoulder, and, turning his back upon him, struck into a path that led from the forest. When he had gone a little way, he looked round, his immense face appearing less like a human countenance than some strange, uncouthly shaped stone toppling on a mountain precipice. "Ving Thor," he said, "let me give you a piece of good advice before I go. When you get to Utgard, don't make much of yourself. You think me a tall man, but you have taller still to see, and you yourself are a very little mankin. Turn back whence you came, and be satisfied that you have learned something of yourself by your journey to Jotunheim." "Mannikin or not, that I will never do," shouted Asa Thor after the giant. "We will meet again, and something more we will learn or teach each other." The giant, however, did not turn back to answer, and Thor and his companions, after looking for some time after him, resumed their journey. Before the sun was quite high in the heavens they came out of the forest, and at noon they found themselves on a vast barren plain, where stood a great city, whose walls of dark rough stone were so high that Thor had to bend his head quite far back to see the top of them. When they approached the entrance to this city, they found that the gates were closed and barred, but the space between the bars was so large that Thor passed through easily, and his companions followed him. The streets of the city were gloomy and still. They walked on for some time without meeting anyone, but at length they came upon a very high building, of which the gates stood open. "Let us go in and see what is going on here," said Thor, and they went. After crossing the threshold they found themselves in an immense banqueting hall. A table stretched from one end to the other of it. Stone thrones stood round the table, and on every throne sat a giant, each one, as Thor glanced round, appearing more grim and cold and stony than the rest. One among them sat on a raised seat, and appeared to be the chief, so to him Thor approached and paid his greetings. The giant chief just glanced at him, and without raising, said in a somewhat careless manner, "It is, I think, a foolish custom to tease tired travelers with questions about their journey. I know without asking that you, little fellow, are Asa Thor. Perhaps, however, you may be in reality taller than you appear. As it is a rule here that no one shall sit down to table until he has performed some wonderful feat, let us hear what you and your followers are famed for, and in what way you choose to prove yourselves worthy to sit down in the company of giants." At this speech, Loki, who had entered the hall cautiously behind Thor, pushed himself forward. "The feat for which I am most famed," he said, "is eating, and it is one which I am just now inclined to perform with right good will. Put food before me, and let me see if any of your followers can dispatch it as quickly as I can." "The feat you speak of is by no means despised," said the king, "and there is one here who would be glad to try his powers against yours. Let Logi," he said to one of his followers, "be summoned to the hall." At this a tall, thin, yellow-faced man approached, and a large trough of meat having been placed in the middle of the hall, Loki sat at one end and Logi at the other, and they began to eat. I hope I shall never see anyone eat as they ate, but the giants all turned their slow-moving eyes to watch them, and in a few minutes they met in the middle of the trough. It seemed at first as if both had eaten exactly the same quantity, but when the thing came to be examined into, it was found that Loki had indeed eaten up all the meat, but that Logi had also eaten the bones and the trough. Then the giants nodded their huge heads and determined that Loki was conquered. The king now turned to Thialfi and asked what he could do. "I was thought swift of foot among the youth of my own country," answered Thialfi, "and I will, if you please, try to run a race with anyone here." "You have chosen a noble sport indeed," said the king, "but you must be a good runner if you could beat him with whom I shall match you." Then he called a slender lad, Hugi by name, and the whole company left the hall, and, going out by an opposite gate to that by which Thor had entered, they came out to an open space, which made a noble race-ground. There the goal was fixed, and Thialfi and Hugi started off together. Thialfi ran fast, fast as the reindeer which hears the wolves howling behind, but Hugi ran so much faster that, passing the goal, he turned round and met Thialfi halfway in the course. "Try again, Thialfi," cried the king, and Thialfi, once more taking his place, flew along the course, with feet scarcely touching the ground, swiftly as an eagle when, from his mountain crag, he swoops on his prey in the valley. But with all his running, he was still a good bow-shot from the goal when Hugi reached it. "You are certainly a good runner," said the king, "but if you mean to win, you must do a little better still than this. But perhaps you wish to surprise us all the more this third time." The third time, however, Thialfi was wearied, and though he did his best, Hugi, having reached the goal, turned and met him not far from the starting point. The giants again looked at each other, and declared that there was no need for further trial, for that Thialfi was conquered. It was now Asa Thor's turn, and all the company looked eagerly at him, while the Utgard king asked by what wonderful feat he chose to distinguish himself. "I will try a drinking match with any of you," Thor said shortly, for, to tell the truth, he cared not to perform anything very worthy in the company in which he found himself. King Utgard appeared pleased with this choice, and when the giants had resumed their seats in the hall, he ordered one of his servants to bring in his drinking cup, called the Cup of Penance, which it was his custom to make his guests drain at a draught, if they had broken any of the ancient rules of the society. "There," he said, handing it to Thor, "we call it well drunk if a person empties it at a single draught. Some, indeed, take it 2, but the very puniest can manage it in 3. Thor looked into the cup. It appeared to him long, but not so very large after all, and being thirsty, he put his lips to it, and thought to make short work of it, and empty it in one good, hearty pull. He drank, and put the cup down again, but, instead of being empty, it was now just so full that it could be moved without danger of spilling. "Ha, ha! You are keeping all of your strength for a second pull, I see," said Utgard, looking in. Without answering, Thor lifted the cup again, and drank with all his might till his breath failed. But when he put down the cup, the liquor had only sunk down a little from the brim. "If you mean to take 3 draughts to it," said Utgard, "you are really leaving yourself a very unfair share for the last time. Look to yourself, Thor, for if you do not acquit yourself better in other feats, we shall not think so much of you here, as they say the Aesir do in Asgard." At this speech Thor felt angry, and, seizing the cup again, he drank a third time, deeper and longer than he had yet done. But when he looked into the cup, he saw that a very small part only of its contents had disappeared. Wearied and disappointed, he put the cup down, and he said he would try no more to empty it. "It is pretty plain," said the king, looking round on the company, "that Asa Thor is by no means the kind of man we always supposed him to be." "Nay," said Thor, "I am willing to try another feat, and you yourselves shall choose what it shall be." "Well," said the king, "there is a game at which our children are used to play. A short time ago I dare not have named it to Asa Thor, but now I am curious to see how he will acquit himself. It is merely to lift my cat from the ground, a childish amusement truly." As he spoke, a large grey cat sprang into the hall, and Thor, stooping forward, put his hand under it to lift. He tried gently at first, but by degrees he put forth all his strength, tugging and straining as he had never done before, but the utmost he could do was to raise one of the cat's paws a little way from the ground. "It is just as I thought," said King Utgard, looking round with a smile, "but we are all willing to allow that the cat is large, and Thor but a little fellow." "Little as you think me," cried Thor. "Who is there who will dare to wrestle with me in my anger?" "In truth," said the king, "I don't think there is anyone here who would choose to wrestle with you. But if wrestle you must, I will call in that old crone Ellie. She has, in her time, laid low many a better man than Asa Thor has shown himself to be." The crone came in. She was old, withered, and toothless, and Thor shrank from the thought of wrestling with her, but he had no choice. She threw her arms round him and drew him towards the ground, and the harder he tried to free himself, the tighter grew her grasp. They struggled long. Thor strove bravely, but a strange feeling of weakness and weariness came over him, and at length he tottered and fell down on one knee before her. At this sight all of the giants laughed aloud, and Utgard, coming up, desired the old woman to leave the hall, and proclaimed that the trials were over. None of his followers would now contend with Asa Thor, he said, and night was approaching. He then invited Thor and his companions to sit down at the table and spend the night with him as his guests. Thor, though feeling somewhat perplexed and mortified, accepted his invitation courteously, and showed by his agreeable behavior during the evening that he knew how to bear being conquered with good grace. In the morning, when Thor and his companions were leaving the city, the king himself accompanied them without the gates, and Thor, looking steadily at him when he turned to bid him farewell, perceived for the first time that he was the very same giant Skrymir with whom he had met in the forest. "Come now, Asa Thor," said the giant with a strange sort of smile on his face. "Tell me truly before you go how you think your journey has turned out, and whether or not I was right in saying that you would meet with better men than yourselves in Jotunheim." "I confess freely," answered Asa Thor, looking out without any false shame on his face, "that I have acquitted myself but humbly, and it grieves me, for I know that in Jotunheim henceforward it will be said that I am a man of little worth." "By my troth, no," cried the giant heartily. "Never should you have come into my city if I had known what a mighty man of valor you really are. And now that you are safely out of it, I will, for once, tell the truth to you, Thor. All this time I have been deceiving you by my enchantments. When you met nigh in the forest, and hurled Mjolnir at my head, I should have been crushed by the weight of your blows, had I not skilfully placed a mountain between myself and you, on which the strokes of your hammer fell, and where you cleft 3 deep ravines, which shall henceforth become verdant valleys. In the same manner I deceived you about the contests in which you were engaged last night. When Loki and Logi sat down before the trough, Loki did indeed eat like hunger itself, but Logi is fire, who with eager consuming tongue licked up both bones and trough. Thialfi is the swiftest of mortal runners, but the slender lad Hugi was my thought, and what speed can ever equal his? So it was in your own trials. When you took such deep draughts from the horn, you little knew what a wonderful feat you were performing. The other end of that horn reached the ocean, and when you come to the shore you will see how far its waters have fallen, and how much the deep sea itself has been diminished by your drow. Hereafter, men watching the going out of the tide will call it the ebb or the drow of Thor. Scarcely less wonderful was the prowess you displayed in the second trial. What appeared to you to be a cat was in reality the Midgard serpent which encircles the world. When we saw you succeed in moving it, we trembled lest the very foundations of earth and sea should be shaken by your strength. Nor need you be ashamed of having been overthrown by the old woman Ellie, for she is old age, and there never has and never will be one whom she has not the power to lay low. We must now part, and you had better not come here again, or attempt anything further against my city, for I shall always defend it by fresh enchantments, and you will never be able to do anything against me." At these words Thor raised Mjolnir and was about to challenge the giant to a fresh trial of strength. But before he could speak, Utgard vanished from his sight, and, turning round to look for the city, he found that it too had disappeared, and that he was standing alone on a smooth, green, empty plain. "What a fool I have been," said Asa Thor aloud, "to allow myself to be deceived by a mountain giant." "Ah," answered a voice from above, "I told you you would learn to know yourself better by your journey to Jotunheim. It is the great use of traveling." Thor turned quickly round again, thinking to see Skrymir behind him, but after looking on every side he could perceive nothing but that a high cloud-capped mountain, which he had noticed on the horizon, appeared to have advanced to the edge of the plain. End of How Thor Went to Jotunheim in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. Read by Tom Finnicle, Metairie, Louisiana, on April 7th, 2023.
A Tyrolean Forester's Legend in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from Tales and Legends of the Tyrol by A. von Gunther. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jean Chilton. A Tyrolean Forester's Legend by A. von Gunther. One day, a poor woman of Lengenfeld in the Utz Valley in the Tyrol went up the mountains to meet her husband who was guarding a flock of goats there. On her way, she passed by a chapel into which she entered, and while she was praying, a lemur vulture swooped down and carried off in his claws her little son, who was amusing himself outside on the moss. But heaven ordained that the vulture should settle with his prey on a peak which was quite close to the goatherd, who frightened him off with stones, and so, without knowing it, he became the preserver of his own child, whom he had not seen since the spring. Now it happened that 3 good fairies who resided in the neighborhood of the Utztal beneath an enormous mountain peak called the Morin had been invisibly active in the saving of the goatherd's boy. The boy grew up and always bore in his mind an attraction to the highest peaks of the mountains. He became a hardy alpine climber, and as such a secret impulse ever pushed him to the heights above Morin. For there, so said the legend, was the paradise of animals. There were herds of gazelles and stonebucks, and no huntsman had ever succeeded in approaching them. But the foolhardy boy wished to try his luck, and commenced his wanderings, which ended by his getting lost and being in danger of his life. One day he didn't know where he was, and from the ice-covered peak which reaches into the clouds over 10,000 feet high, he slipped down upon a green alp which he had been unable to see from above, and in that fall he lost his senses. As he came again to himself, he was lying on a beautiful bed in the crystal cave of the 3 fairies who had saved him for the 2nd time. They stood round him, shining with heavenly benevolence and love, and their look awakened in him the sweetest sensations. He remained now a well-cared-for guest of the fairies, was allowed to look at their beautiful abode, their gardens, and their pets. he was told that his amiable hostesses were the protecting genii of all alpine animals, and they made him promise never to kill or to hurt one of those innocent creatures. No gazelle, no alpine hare, no snow hen, not even a weasel. He was allowed to remain with them 3 days, and had permission to worship and adore them. But then he was obliged to promise 3 things faithfully, and on his soul's salvation, if he wanted to return to them, or in case he never cared to do so, if ever he wished to live happily down in the valley. Firstly, he was bound to observe a silence as deep as the grave that he had ever seen the 3 fairies or been in their presence. Secondly, they made him swear the promise which he had already given, never to do any harm to any alpine animal. And thirdly, never to let human eyes see the way which they were going to show him, and through which he might be the more easily able to return to their abode. A 4th promise they left to his honor, without binding him down by oath or vow, and that was to preserve the love which he had shown to them, and never to have anything to do in any way with any other girl. Then, after a tender parting, the son of the Alps was taken into a steep mountain gully, which led down to the valley of the rushing Aachen, which tears along under bowers of alpine rose bushes. After these injunctions, the fairies told him that on every full moon night he was allowed to pay them a visit of 3 days' duration, and that he had only to enter through that gully and give below a certain sign with which they acquainted him. The boy returned home completely altered. It seemed as though he was dreaming, and soon enough from everyone he gained the name of the dreamer, for henceforth he never took an alpine stock in his hand, never went hunting, and never to a village dance. But every full moon night he stole quietly to the chasm in the rock, deep beneath the moraine, entered into the interior of the mountain, and was for 3 days happy with the fairies, to whose wondrous songs he listened entranced. At home his form shrank. He became pale and emaciated, and it was in vain that his parents and friends pressed him to tell what was the matter with him. "Nothing at all," he always answered to these questions. "I am as happy as I can be." As his father and mother had become aware of his secret strolls on the full moon nights, they followed him once, quietly, and close at the entrance of the chasm his ear was struck by his mother's voice, who called his name, and at that same moment the rocks shut together before his eyes, and the mountain crashed down with the noise of thunder, so that rocks fell down upon rocks. The poor boy's happiness was gone forever. Troubled and abstracted, he returned to his native village. He cared neither for his mother's tears nor his father's reproaches, and remained apathetic and indifferent to everything. And so he faded away until autumn arrived, until the herds were driven down into the winter stables of the village, and the beautiful summer life of the mountain world died and was covered with snow. Then one day 2 friends of the goatherd arrived, and talked of a hunting excursion which they intended to make on the top of the moraine. And then, for the first time again, the eyes of the pale young alpine hunter became bright. The irresistible love of hunting awakened again in him. Perhaps, too, there was some greater attraction. He longed to penetrate once more into the dominion of the fairies, be it even at the risk of his life. As to life, he no longer valued it, and death was a liberation. The infatuated youth prepared his hunting things, borrowed an alpine stock, for his own had been left behind, broken in his fall from the peak of the moraine, and then he joined the hunting excursion, which started in early morning. First he walked with them. Then he hurried before, higher and higher, as though he was attracted by the most irresistible power. His heart grew light as he ascended, For too long the heavy air of the narrow valley had oppressed him. He climbed as quickly as though he had eaten arsenic, that fearful poison which many an alpine climber takes in the smallest quantities to make himself lighter, and at last he caught sight of a sentry gazelle, which whistled and disappeared behind the peak upon which it had been standing. The young alpine hunter climbed to the top of the peak, from whence he saw down below him a little green spot, upon which were browsing, though far beyond his reach, a large herd of gazelles. Only one of them came within range, and this one he pursued pitilessly until the poor animal in her anxiety and terror was unable to proceed further, and stopped on the edge of a precipice, which the huntsman in his excitement had never noticed. He leveled his rifle. The plaintive cry of a female voice resounded in his ears, but he paid no heed to it. He took deadly aim and fired. Lo, at that moment he was surrounded by a halo of brightness, and in the midst of that brilliant light stood the gazelle, unhurt, and before her floated the three fairies in dazzling splendor, but with severe and angry countenances. They approached him, but on seeing their faces without one smile or look of love upon them, the boy was seized with a deep horror. He staggered one step more, and backwards he fell down the precipice 1,000 feet deep, and from the edge, where in falling his feet had stood, pieces of stone rolled down, and a tremendous wall of rock tore down after him with a fearful roar, and buried him forever beneath its debris. There still stands the rock, which is pointed out even to this day as the huntsman's grave. End of a Tyrolean Forester's Legend in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
Harisarman in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from Indian Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Arnav Darnell. Harisarman, compiled by Joseph Jacobs. There was a certain Brahmar in a certain village named Harisarman. He was poor and foolish, and in evil case for want of employment. And he had very many children, that he might reap the fruit of his misdeeds in a former life. He wandered about, begging with his family, and at last he reached a certain city, and entered the service of a rich householder called Stuladatta. His sons became keepers of Stuladatta's cows and other property, and his wife a servant to him. And he himself lived near his house, performing the duty of an attendant. One day there was a feast, on account of the marriage of the daughter of Stuladatta, largely attended by many friends of the bridegroom and merrymakers. Harisarman hoped that he would be able to fill himself up to the throat with ghee and flesh and other dainties, and get the same for his family in the house of his patron. While he was anxiously expecting to be fed, no one thought of him. Then he was distressed at getting nothing to eat, and he said to his wife at night, "It is owing to my poverty and stupidity that I am treated with such disrespect here. So I will pretend, by means of an artifice, to possess a knowledge of magic, so that I may become an object of respect to this Stuladatta. So, when you get an opportunity, tell him that I possess magical knowledge." He said this to her, and after turning the matter over in his mind, while people were asleep, he took away from the house of Stuladatta a horse on which his master's son-in-law rode. He placed it in concealment at some distance, and in the morning the friends of the bridegroom could not find the horse, though they searched in every direction. Then, while Sthuladatta was distressed at the evil omen and searching for the thieves who had carried off the horse, the wife of Harisarman came and said to him, "My husband is a wise man, skilled in astrology and magical sciences. He can get the horse back for you. Why do you not ask him?" When Sthuladatta heard that, he called Harisarman, who said, "Yesterday I was forgotten, but today, now the horse is stolen, I am called to mind." And Sthuladatta then propitiated the Brahmar with these words, "I forgot you, forgive me," and asked him to tell him who had taken away their horse. Then Harisarman drew all kinds of pretended diagrams and said, "The horse has been placed by thieves on the boundary line south from this place. It is concealed there, and before it is carried off to a distance, as it will be at close of day, go quickly and bring it." When they heard that, many men ran and brought the horse quickly, praising the discernment of Harisarman. Then Harisarman was honoured by all men as a sage, and dwelt there in happiness, honoured by Sthuladatta. Now, as days went on, much treasure, both of gold and jewels, had been stolen by a thief from the palace of the king. As the thief was not known, the king quickly summoned Harisarman, on account of his reputation for knowledge of magic. And he, when summoned, tried to gain time, and said, "I will tell you tomorrow." And then he was placed in a chamber by the king, and carefully guarded. And he was sad, because he had pretended to have knowledge. Now, in that palace, there was a maid named Jiva, which means tongue, who, with the assistance of a brother, had stolen that treasure from the interior of the palace. She, being alarmed at Harisarman's knowledge, went at night and applied her ear to the door of that chamber in order to find out what he was about. And Harisarman, who was alone inside, was at that very moment blaming his own tongue that had made a vain assumption of knowledge. He said, "O tongue, what is this that you have done through your greediness? Wicked one, you will soon receive punishment in full." When Jiva heard this, she thought, in her terror, that she had been discovered by this wise man. And she managed to get in where he was, and falling at his feet, she said to the supposed wizard, "Brahman, here I am, that Jiva whom you have discovered to be the thief of the treasure. And after I took it, I buried it in the earth, in a garden behind the palace, under a pomegranate tree. So spare me, and receive the small quantity of gold which is in my possession." When Harisarman heard that, he said to her proudly, "Depart. I know all this. I know the past, present, and future. But I will not denounce you, being a miserable creature that has implored my protection. But whatever gold is in your possession, you must give back to me." When he said this to the maid, she consented and departed quickly. But Harisarman reflected in his astonishment. Fate brings about, as if in sport, things impossible. For when calamity was so near, who would have thought chance would have brought us success? While I was blaming my Jiva, the thief Jiva suddenly flung herself at my feet. Secret crimes manifest themselves by means of fear. Thus thinking, he passed the night happily in the chamber. And in the morning, he brought the king, by some skillful parade of pretended knowledge, into the garden and led him up to the treasure, which was buried under the pomegranate tree, and said that the thief had escaped with a part of it. Then the king was pleased, and gave him the revenue of many villages. But the minister, named Devajnanan, whispered in the king's ear, "How can a man possess such knowledge, unattainable by men, without having studied the books of magic? You may be certain that this is a specimen of the way he makes a dishonest livelihood. by having a secret intelligence with thieves. It will be much better to test him by some new artifice. Then the king, of his own accord, brought a covered pitcher, into which he had thrown a frog, and said to Harisarman, "Brahman, if you can guess what there is in this pitcher, I will do you great honour today." When the Brahman Harisarman heard that, he thought that his last hour had come, and he called to mind the pet name of Froggy, which his father had given him in his childhood in sport. And impelled by luck, he called to himself by his pet name, lamenting his hard fate, and suddenly called out, "This is a fine pitcher for you, Froggy. It will soon become the swift destroyer of your helpless self." The people there, when they heard him say that, raised a shout of applause, because his speech chimed in so well with the object presented to him, and murmured, "Ah, a great sage. He knows even about the frog." Then the king, thinking that this was all due to knowledge of divination, was highly delighted, and gave Harisarman the revenue of more villages, with gold, an umbrella, and state carriages of all kinds. So Harisarman prospered in the world. End of Harisarman in Myths and Legends Around the World. Collection 18.
"12 Feet of Nose" in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from Roman Legends, a collection of the fables and folklore of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Luke Gagan. There was a poor old father who was very poor indeed, and very old. When he came to die, he called his 3 sons round his bed, and said they must summon a notary to make his will. The sons looked at each other, and thought he was doting. He repeated his desire, and then one of them ventured to say, "But father, dear, why should we go to the expense of calling in a notary? There is not a single thing on earth you have to leave us." But the old man told them again to call a notary, and still they hesitated, because they thought the notary would say that they were making a game of him. At last the old man began to get angry when he found they would not do as he said, and, just not to vex him in his last moments, they called the notary, and the notary brought his witness. Then the father was content, and called them all to his bedside. "Now, pull out the old case under the bed, and take out what you find there." They found an old broken hat without a brim, a ragged purse that was so worn you could have not trusted any money in its keeping, and a horn. These 3 things he bequeathed in due form of law, one to each of his sons, and it was only because they saw that the man was in his death agony that those who were called to act as witnesses could keep from laughing. To the notary, of course, it was all one whether it was an old hat or a new one. His part was the same, and when he had done what was needed, he went his way, and the witness went with him. But as they went out, they said to one another, "Poor old man! Perhaps it is a comfort to him in his last moments to fancy he has got something to leave." When they were all gone, as the 3 sons were standing by, very sad, and looking at each other, not knowing what to make of the strange scene, he called the eldest, to whose portion the hat had fallen, and said, "See what I've given you." "Why, father," answered he, "it isn't even good enough to bind round one's knee when one goes out to hoeing." But the father answered, "I wouldn't let you know its value until the people were gone, lest any should take it from you. This is its value, that if you put it on, you can go and dine whatever inn you please, or sit down to drink at what wine shop you please, and take what you like and drink what you like, for no one will see you while you have it on." He then called his 2nd son, to whose the purse had fallen, and he said, "See what I have given you." "Why, father," answered the son, "it isn't even good enough to keep a little tobacco in.
if I could afford to buy any. But the father answered, I wouldn't tell you its worth until your people had gone, lest any should take it from you. But this is its value. If you put your fingers in, you will find a scudo there, and after that another, and another, and as many as ever you will. There will always be one. Then he called his youngest son, and said, See what I have given you. And he answered, Yes, father, it is a very nice horn, and when I am starving hungry, I can cheat myself into being content by playing on it. Silly boy, answered the father, that is not its use. I wouldn't tell you its value when those people were here, lest they should take it from you. Its value is this, that whenever you want anything, you have only to sound it, and one will come who will bring whatever you want, be it a dinner, a suit of clothes, a palace, or an army. After this, the father died, and each found himself well provided with the legacy he had given him. It happened that one day, as the second son was passing under the window of the palace, a waiting maid looked out and said, Can you play cards? As well as most, answered the youth. Very well, then come up, answered the waiting maid, for the queen wants someone to play with her. Very readily he went up, therefore, and played at cards with the queen, and when he had played all the evening, he had lost 50 scudi. Never mind about paying the 50 scudi, said the queen, as he rose to leave. We only played to pass the time, and you don't look by your dress as if you could afford 50 scudi. Not at all, replied the youth. I will certainly bring the 50 scudi in the morning. And in the morning, by putting his fingers 50 times into the ragged purse, he had the required sum, and went back to it with the palace and paid the queen. The queen was very much astonished that such a shabby-looking fellow should have such a command of money, and determined to find out how it was. So she made him stay and dine. After dinner, she took him to a private room and said to him, Tell me, how comes it that you, who are but shabby-looking fellow, have such command of money? Oh, answered he, quite unspeculatingly, because my father left me a wonderful purse, in which is always a scudo. Nonsense, answered the queen. That is a very pretty fable, but such purses don't exist. Oh, but it is so indeed, answered the youth. Quite impossible, persisted the queen. But here it is, you can see for yourself, pursued the incautious youth, taking it out. The queen took it from him as if to try its powers, but no sooner was she in possession of it than she called in the guard to turn out a fellow who was trying to rob her, and give him a good beating. Indignant at such treatment, the youth went to his eldest brother, and begged of him that he might, by its means, go and punish the queen. Putting on the hat, he went back to the palace at the hour of dinner, and sat down to table. As soon as the queen was served, he took her plate, and ate up all that was on it, one course after the other, so that the queen got nothing. And finding it useless to call for more dishes, she gave it up as a bad job, and went into her room. The youth followed her in, and demanded the return of his wonderful purse. How can I know it is you that I don't see you? Said the queen. Never mind about seeing me. Put the purse out on the table for me, and I will take it. No, I can't if I don't see you, replied the queen. I can't believe it is you, unless I see you. The youth fell into the snare, and took off his hat. How do you manage to make yourself invisible? Asked the queen. Just by putting on this old hat. I don't believe that could make you invisible, exclaimed the queen. Let me try. And she snatched the hat out of his hand and put it on. Of course she was now in turn invisible, and he sought her in vain, but worse than that, she rang the bell for the guard and bid them turn the shabby youth out and give him a bastonata. Full of fresh indignation, he ran to his youngest brother and told him all this story. begging the loan of his horn, that he might punish the queen by its means, and the brother lent it him. He sounded the horn, and one comes. "I want an army with cannons to throw down the palace," said the youth, and instantly there was a tramp of armed men and a rumble of artillery wagons. The queen was sitting at dinner, but when she heard all the noise she came to the window. Meantime the soldiers had surrounded the palace and pointed their guns. "What's all this about? What's the matter?" cried the queen out of the window. "The matter is that I want my purse and my hat back," answered the youth. "To be sure, you are right. Here they are. I don't want my palace battered down, so I'll give them to you." The youth went up to receive them, but when he got upstairs, he found the queen half sunk, fainting in a chair. "Oh, I'm so frightened. I can't think where I put the things. Only send away that army, and I'll look for them immediately." The youth sent away the army, and the queen got up and began looking for the things. "Tell me," she said, as she wandered from one cupboard to another, "how did you, who are such a shabby-looking fellow, manage to call together such an army?" "Because I've got this horn," answered the youth, "and with it I can call up whatever I want. If you don't make haste and find the purse and the hat, I'll call up the army again and batter down the palace in right earnest." "You won't make me believe that," replied the queen. "That sorry horn can't work such wonders as that. Let me try." And she took the horn out of his hands and sounded it, and one appeared. "Two stout men," she commanded quickly, and when they came she bid them drive the shabby-looking youth out of the palace and give him a bastonata. He was now quite undone, and was ashamed to go back to his brothers. So he wandered away outside the town. After much walking he came to a vineyard where he strolled in, and what struck him was that though it was January, there was a fine fig tree covered with ripe, luscious figs. "This is a godsend indeed," he said, to a hungry man, and he began plucking and eating the figs. Before he had eaten many, however, he found that his nose had begun to grow to a terrible size, a foot for every fig. "That'll never do," he cried, and left off eating the figs and wandered on. Presently he came to another vineyard, where he also strolled in. There, though it was January, he saw a tree all covered with ripe red cherries. "I wonder what calamity will pursue me for eating them," he said, as he gathered them. But when he had eaten a good many, he perceived that at last his luck had turned, for in proportion as he ate his nose grew less and less, until at last it was just the right size again. "Now I know how to punish the queen," he said, and he filled a bottle with the juice of the cherries, and went back and gathered a basketful of figs. These figs he carried under the palace window, and as he had got more dusty and threadbare with his late wanderings, no one recognized him. "Figs in January! That is a treat!" And they bought up the whole basketful. Then, as they ate, their noses all began to grow, but the queen, as she was very greedy, ate 12 for her share, so that she had 12 feet of nose added to the length of hers. It was so long that it trailed behind her on the ground as she walked along. Then there was a hue and cry. All the surgeons and physicians in the kingdom were sent for, but could do no good. They were all in despair, when our youth came up disguised as a foreign doctor. "Noses! I can heal noses! Whoever has got too much nose, let him come to me!" All the inhabitants gathered round him, and the queen called him loudest of all. "The medicine I have to give is necessarily a very strong one to effect so extraordinary a cure. Therefore I won't give it to the Queen's Majesty till she has seen it used on all her servants, beginning with the lowest." Taking them all in order, beginning with the lowest, he gave a few drops of cherry juice to each, and all their noses came right. Last of all, the Queen remained. "The Queen can't be treated like common people," he said. "She must be treated by herself, I must go into her room with her, and I can cure her with 1 drop of my cordial." "You think yourself very clever that you talk of curing with 1 drop of your cordial, but you are not the only person who can work wonders. I've got greater wonders than you. I've got a hat which makes you invisible, a purse that is never empty, and a horn that gives you everything you call for." "Very pretty things to talk about," answered the pretend doctor. "But such things don't exist." "Don't they?" said the queen. "There they are." And she laid them all out on the table. This was enough for him. Taking advantage of the lesson she had given him by her example, he quickly put on the hat, making himself invisible. After that, it was easy to snatch up the other things and escape, nor could anyone follow him. He lived very comfortably for the rest of his life, taking a scudo out of his purse for whatever he had to pay, and his brothers likewise got on very well with their legacies, for he restored them as soon as he had rescued them from the queen. But the queen remained for the rest of her life with 12 feet of nose. End of 12 Feet of Nose in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.
The Convent Free from Care in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18, from 24 Unusual Stories for Boys and Girls. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Convent Free from Care by Anna Cogswell Tyler. Once when Emperor Charles V was traveling in the country, he saw a convent, and in passing by a little door he read this strange inscription: "Here you live without a care." The emperor was very surprised and could scarcely believe his eyes. "It seems to me an impossibility," he thought. "Does someone really exist on earth who is free from care? As emperor, I am overwhelmed with troubles, while here in this convent, which is a little kingdom in itself, one would have nothing to worry about. I cannot believe it." Immediately on setting foot in the village inn, the emperor sent the hostess to fetch the abbot of this singular convent. You can imagine what a state of mind the latter was in when he heard he was summoned to the emperor's presence. "What have I done to displease him?" he asked himself. On the way he examined his conscience over and over again, and he could think of no fault of which he was guilty. "I am in troubled waters. I must steer my way through," he said. When he was in the emperor's presence, the latter expressed his astonishment of what he had read. The abbot now knew why he had been summoned, and smiled. "Sir," he said, "does that astonish you? However, it is very simple. We eat, we drink, we sleep, and we worry over nothing." "Well, reverend abbot, that state of things must come to an end," said the emperor, "and in order that you may have your share of trouble, I command you to bring me tomorrow the answers to the 3 following questions. First, what is the depth of the sea? Secondly, how many cows' tails would it take to measure the distance between the earth and the sun? Thirdly, what am I thinking about? Try to please me, or I shall extract a penalty from you." On hearing these words, the abbot returned to his convent with a heavy heart. From that moment he knew no peace. He cudgelled his brains as to what answer he could make to the emperor. When the little bell of the abbey rang, summoning the monks to prayer and chapel, the abbot continued to pace his garden. He was so deep in thought that he was quite oblivious of what was taking place around him. Even if a thunderbolt had fallen at his feet, he would not have noticed it. "What a horrible thing," he thought. "Is it possible that such a misfortune has overtaken me? I cannot possibly answer. Who can save the situation? Perhaps our shepherd could. He has a very lively imagination. But talk of the devil!" At that identical moment the shepherd appeared, leading his flock. He was very surprised to see the abbot, who was always without a care, meditating in solitude. What could have happened? Without more ado, he went to him and asked him what was troubling him so deeply. "Yes, I deserve to be pitied," said the abbot, and he told him what had happened. "Why are you tormenting yourself over a little thing like that?" the shepherd laughingly replied. "Leave it to me, and all will be well. Tomorrow I will come here and dress myself in your robe, and I will turn the tables on him." At first the abbot demurred, but in the end he yielded, and the matter was settled. The next day the shepherd went boldly to find the emperor. "Well, Reverend Abbot," the emperor said serenely, "have you found out the answers?" "Yes, certainly, sire." "Speak, I am listening." "Sire, the sea is as deep as a stone's throw. To measure the distance between the earth and the sun, you need only one cow's tail, if it is long enough. Do you wish to know, sire, what you are thinking? Well, at this moment you think, sire, that the abbot of the convent is in your presence, and it is only his shepherd." The emperor laughed so heartily that if he has not stopped laughing, he is laughing still. The end of The Convent Free from Care in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. Read by Tom Finnicle, Metairie, Louisiana, on April 27th, 2023.
The Fairy Fisherman in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18. From Fairy Tales and Folklore of New Zealand and the South Seas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. The Fairy Fisherman by Edward Robert Tregear. A chief named Kahu was one day walking along the sand which edges the sea, when he noticed some footprints which did not seem to him as if they had been made by mortals. He was very tired, for he had journeyed a long way and still had further to go before he could arrive at the home of the relatives he was on his way to visit. So he sat down and rested, looking about him at the footmarks, and he was not long engaged in glancing about before he perceived signs as of fish having been caught and cleaned on the beach. He was very puzzled, and said to himself, "If these had been human visitors, some of the grass and reeds on which they sat in their canoe would be scattered about the place. Moreover, they must have been fishing in the dark. Surely this is the work of fairies." Thinking thus, he withdrew from the place, and returned to rest a while, determining to visit the place when night fell, and to try and discover something more about the supernatural fisherman. When the darkness came on, he returned to the beach, and waited there for many hours, until he was tired out, and almost ready to give up his watching, when suddenly he heard a voice cry, "The net here! The net here!" The fairies had returned to fish for mackerel, and soon Kahu saw 2 canoes with their elfin crews busily employed in laying nets. The fairies sang away over their work, their song being something like this: "Drop the net in the water here, haul the net from the water there," the voices ringing out louder and louder. Kahu was a small and unusually fair-skinned man, almost as white as the fairies themselves. So he slipped out among the fairies who were hauling the net, and pulled away lustily with the others, none of them observing that he was not one of themselves. The fairies changed their song when the net began to get near the shore, singing, "Go out into the sea, keep the net from the rocks, protect the precious net from the rugged cutting rocks." Soon the ripples caused by the net nearing the shore began running up the beach, and the fish were seen splashing in the shallow water and flapping on the sand. The fairies ran about picking up the fish, each fairy making up a bundle of spoil by running a string through the gills. The grey dawn was beginning to appear, so they hurried and bustled about as swiftly as they could, singing, "Make haste, hurry, hurry, run here, run there, thread the fish, end the work, soon will come the sun." Kahu worked away also at picking up fish and stringing them. but he omitted to make a knot at the end of his string, and as fast as he put the fish on, they slipped off again. The sly fellow was trying to delay all he could so that he might gain time and allow the sun to rise before the work was finished. One fairy would run and assist him to make a knot, then another, but hardly had his help was gone, then Kahu would untie the knot and let the fish go. This went on so long, the others being delayed through helping him, that at last dawn appeared, and there was light enough to see one another distinctly. Then the fairies saw that Kahu was not one of themselves, but was a human being. With cries of dismay and fright, they rushed away and hid themselves, leaving their canoes and nets on the shore, together with all their fish. It was a very lucky night's work for Kahu, because from the nets left by the fairies, the Maori people learned how to make the netting knot, which before that time they had not known, and this art of making nets has ever since been known and practiced. End of The Fairy Fisherman in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 18.